Chapter 3. The Boxer Uprising and the New Era of Warring States. By the end of the 19th century, the Chinese world order was totally out of joint. The court in Beijing no longer functioned as a meaningful factor in protecting either Chinese culture or autonomy. Popular frustration boiled to the surface in 1898, in the so-called Boxer Uprising. Practicing a form of ancient mysticism, and claiming magical immunity to foreign bullets, the Boxers, so called because of their traditional martial arts exercises, mounted a campaign of violent agitation against foreigners and the symbols of the new order they had imposed. Diplomats, Chinese Christians, railroads, telegraph lines, and Western schools all came under attack. Perhaps judging that the Manchu court, itself a foreign imposition, and no longer a particularly effective one, risked becoming the next target, the Empress Dowager embraced the Boxers, praising their attacks. The epicenter of the conflict was once again the long-contested foreign embassies in Beijing, which the Boxers besieged in the spring of 1900. After a century of vacillating between haughty disdain, defiance, and anguished conciliation, China now entered a state of war against all of the foreign powers, simultaneously. The consequence was another harsh blow. An 8-power allied expeditionary force, consisting of France, Britain, the United States, Japan, Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, arrived in Beijing in August 1900 to relieve the embassies. After suppressing the Boxers and allied Qing troops, and laying waste to much of the capital in the process, they dictated another unequal treaty imposing a cash indemnity and granting further occupation rights to the foreign powers. A dynasty unable to prevent repeated foreign marches on the Chinese capital or to forestall foreign exactions from Chinese territory had plainly lost the mandate of heaven. The Qing Dynasty, having prolonged its existence for a remarkable 7 decades since the initial clash with the West, collapsed in 1912. China's central authority was again fractured, and it entered another period of warring states. A Chinese republic, deeply divided from its birth, emerged into a dangerous international environment. But it never had the opportunity to practice democratic virtues. The nationalist leader Sun Yat-sen was proclaimed president of the new republic in January 1912. As if by some mysterious law commanding imperial unity, Sun, after just 6 weeks in office, deferred to Yuan Shikai, commander of the only military force capable of unifying the country. After the failure of Yuan's abortive declaration of a new imperial dynasty in 1916, political power devolved into the hands of regional governors and military commanders. Meanwhile, in the Chinese heartland, the new Chinese Communist Party, established in 1921, administered a kind of shadow government and parallel social order loosely aligned with the world communist movement. Each of these aspirants claimed the right to rule, but none was strong enough to prevail over the others. Left without a universally acknowledged central authority, China lacked the instrument for the conduct of its traditional diplomacy. By the end of the 1920s, the Nationalist Party, led by Chiang Kai-shek, exercised nominal control over the entirety of the ancient Qing Empire. In practice, however, China's traditional territorial prerogatives were increasingly challenged. Exhausted by their exertions in the war and in a world influenced by Wilsonian principles of self-determination, the Western powers were no longer in a position to extend their spheres of influence in China. They were barely able to sustain them. Russia was consolidating its internal revolution, and in no position to undertake further expansion. Germany was deprived of its colonies altogether. Of the former contestants for dominance in China, only one was left, albeit the most dangerous to China's independence, Japan. China was not strong enough to defend itself. And no other country was available to balance Japan militarily. After the defeat of Germany in the First World War, Japan occupied the former German concessions in Shandong. In 1932, Tokyo engineered the creation of a secessionist, Japanese-dominated state of Montecuo in Manchuria. In 1937, it embarked on a program of conquest across much of eastern China. Japan now found itself in the position of previous conquerors. It was difficult enough to conquer such a vast country. It was impossible to administer it without relying on some of its cultural precepts, which Japan, prizing the uniqueness of its own institutions, was never prepared to do. Gradually, its erstwhile partners, the European powers backed by the United States, began to move into opposition to Japan, first politically and eventually militarily. It was a kind of culmination of the policy of the self-strengthening diplomacy, with the former colonialists now cooperating to vindicate the integrity of China. The leader of this effort was the United States, and its instrument was the open-door policy proclaimed by Secretary of State John Hay in 1899. Originally intended to claim for the United States the benefits of other countries' individual imperialism, it was transformed in the 1930s into a way to preserve China's independence. The Western powers joined the effort. China would now be able to overcome the imperialist phase, provided it could survive the Second World War and once again forge its unity. With the Japanese surrender in 1945, China was left devastated and divided. The nationalists and communists both aspired to central authority. 2 million Japanese soldiers remained on Chinese territory for repatriation. The Soviet Union recognized the nationalist government but had kept its options open by supplying arms to the Communist Party. At the same time, it had rushed a massive and uninvited Soviet military force into northeast China to restore some of their erstwhile colonial claims. Beijing's tenuous control of Xinjiang had eroded further. Tibet and Mongolia had gravitated into quasi-autonomy, aligned with the respective orbits of the British Empire and the Soviet Union. United States public opinion sympathized with Chiang Kai-shek as a wartime ally. But Chiang Kai-shek was governing a fragment of a country already fragmented by foreign occupation. China was treated as one of the Big Five who would organize the post-war world and were granted a veto in the United Nations Security Council. Of the five, only the United States and the Soviet Union possessed the power to carry out this mission. A renewal of the Chinese Civil War followed. Washington sought to apply its standard solution to such civil conflict, which has failed time after time then and in the decades afterward. It urged a coalition between the nationalists and communists, who had been battling each other for 2 decades. U.S. Ambassador Patrick Hurley convened a meeting between Chiang Kai-shek and Communist Party leader Mao Zedong in September 1945 at Jiang's capital in Chongqing. Both leaders dutifully attended while preparing for a final showdown. No sooner had the Hurley meeting concluded than the two sides recommenced hostilities. Jiang's nationalist forces opted for a strategy of holding cities, while Mao's guerrilla armies based themselves in the countryside. Each sought to surround the other using Weiqi strategies of encirclement. Amidst clamor for American intervention in support of the nationalists, President Harry Truman sent General George Marshall to China for a year-long effort to encourage the two sides to agree to work together. During that time, the nationalist military position was collapsing. Defeated by the communists on the mainland, nationalist troops retreated to the island of Taiwan in 1949. The nationalists brought with them their military apparatus, political class, and remnants of national authority, including Chinese artistic and cultural treasures from the Imperial Palace collection. They declared the relocation of the Republic of China's capital to Taipei, and maintained that they would husband their strength and someday return to the mainland. They retained the Chinese seat in the United Nations Security Council. Meanwhile, China was uniting again, under the newly proclaimed People's Republic of China. Communist China launched itself into a new world, in structure, a new dynasty, in substance, a new ideology for the first time in Chinese history. Strategically, it abutted over a dozen neighbors, with open frontiers and inadequate means to deal simultaneously with each potential threat, the same challenge that had confronted Chinese governments throughout history. Overarching all these concerns, the new leaders of China faced the involvement in Asian affairs of the United States, which had emerged from the Second World War as a confident superpower, with second thoughts about its passivity when confronted with the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War. Every statesman needs to balance the experience of the past against the claims of the future. Nowhere was this more true than in the China that Mao and the Communist Party had just taken over.